my name's Martin and I'm going to be talking today about data migrations. Here's a little bit about me to get us started. So I'm a solution principal at Slalom. I've spent about 16 years in CRM and 8 years in Salesforce specifically. And data integration and migrations have been a theme throughout my career. You can catch me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or just email me if you want. So, data migrations. I'm expecting that most of you on this feed are interested in data migrations, probably done them, and you won't be surprised if I tell you that they're rather difficult. So this talk is going to be about how can we make them less painful. So first of all, it's more than just a technical exercise, and I think there are 4 primary features of a successful data migration that we should consider, and those are: firstly, the data, pretty obvious. Then the methods, how are we going to do the migration? The technology, which is what tools are we going to use to do the migration? And finally, the people. So I'm going to walk through each of these in turn and show you some of the subsections or sub-features of these aspects of a data migration. So let's start with data. What's the first thing we need to do with our data? Well, it's quality. We've got to make sure that we know what the quality of our data is. So, to do that, we need to define data quality rules for all of the data that's entering our migration pipeline. I recommend that you don't try and cleanse the data during your migration. This might sound crazy, however, if you do things like merge records, merge contacts or merge accounts as you're migrating, it becomes very, very difficult to then be sure that you haven't lost some records at the end. If you're counting how many records are in the source, how many are in the target environment, if you've merged a few, how do you know whether the fact that you've got different numbers are because you've got fewer records, because something's dropped out by an error, or because you just merged them? So, the other part of the quality area is around estimating the execution time for how long that data with that quality is going to end up going through the pipeline. So what sort of things might you encounter with data quality that would cause you problems? Well, email address formatting, field lengths, data type mismatches, all that sort of stuff. If you're migrating from something that isn't Salesforce, then potentially referential integrity could cause you problems as well. And sometimes people do things like storing Salesforce IDs in text fields. That's also something to look out for. The next area under data is location. So we need to know, where is our data going to be? Usually for a Salesforce to Salesforce migration, that will be pretty easy to see. It will be either in one org or the other. But we may also, if we're not using Salesforce for one end of that migration, where is that data? Are we moving it across borders? Does that cause us any legal issues? Volume. So how much data are we moving? How quickly do we need to move it? Can our tools support that volume of data? And can the target system support that? So I know there's some other talks today looking at high data volumes, but it's something you really need to know. Will you blow your storage limits? Will it cost you a lot more money to store this data in Salesforce? What other things should you consider? It also affects how quickly you can move it. If you're trying to move 1 million records using Excel, apart from being a complete pain, you're probably not going to be able to do it very quickly at all. So that's what we need to know about volume. Finally, to finish off the data triangle, security. Very, very important, especially if you're migrating PII data. Who's going to have access to that data? How are you going to secure the access to that data? Do the security models in the source and target systems match? Are you going to load in a load of records into the target org and accidentally give access to everybody to some rather sensitive information? You must check that and ensure that you've got the appropriate coverage. And also consider your obligations under GDPR around who's doing the processing and where that processing is taking place. So, to summarise then on data, our first main feature of a data migration, we want to define and enforce our data quality rules for everything coming into the pipeline. Don't cleanse the data during the migration. Estimate our migration execution time and consider our platform limits and system performance. And if possible, keep the data in the client's domain of control. That will simplify things, certainly legally, if they remain the data processor. Okay, so that's the first set of features. Let's talk now about methods, the next part of our pyramid. First up, I'd say, is the contract. So I'm looking at this from the point of view of a Salesforce partner, a consultancy, going in and migrating another person's, another entity's data. And that's where the contracting can be absolutely critical. But equally, you might want to consider this if you're working internally as the contract between you and your business unit. A lot of the times we want to delegate as much risk as possible to other parties. And that's true with data migrations, as everyone tends to treat them as very risky enterprises. But we often underestimate the complexity of the migration. So what I recommend is to separate out the project into two parts. Firstly, the discovery and the design of the migration, and then the execution. Because once you've got a clearer idea of how many objects, how complex your migration is going to be, you can then re-estimate for your execution, and that will be more accurate and more reliable. So moving on to that discovery and design part, what are we going to do? What are we trying to find out in this part of the project? So we want to know how are we going to do the migration. We need to come up with a data migration strategy, which covers how, who, when, where, and what if. And then we want to look at a data mapping, which is a lot more detailed and covers the scope of the migration. So which objects, which fields, which systems, and what transformations do we need to do that? I've got a few recommendations here for the contents of these documents, so I'm not going to go through those in line by line. But you want to cover the key things that describe how the project's going to proceed and what's going to happen if things go wrong, so that you can communicate to all your stakeholders what to expect at the end of the migration. So this is the data strategy document contents, and your mapping document should cover these areas. It should describe, map, verify, and discover and plan for your project. You're looking to find all those skeletons, all those dodgy bits of data, those crazy bits of technical debt that have caused strange things in your data schema. You want to pull those out early so that you don't encounter them later on. Once you've got all that together, you can then start to look at the estimate for effort. And I would say that the length of time for your migration is proportional to the number of systems, the number of objects, the number of fields, and the number of transformations. I don't think I can go any more specific than that, because it's always the devil is in the detail. But if you've got more than 2 systems, things are going to get very complicated. Okay, the next part of our methods pyramid is build. How are you going to do the build of your process? So let's look a bit at that. I would recommend a classic ETL. So you're going to pull the data out of the source system, transform it a bit in a staging database, and then load it into Salesforce after that. I have a pattern for this, which involves 5 main jobs, and I'm going to dive out into Talend in a minute to show you this. You're going to have a get job, which pulls the data out of the source system, a map job, which then does the transformation, a put job to put that data into the target system, and then a couple of orchestration jobs. One, a delete job to remove the data and do your rollback, and then a run job, which pulls everything together and allows you to do the get, map, and put, or to run all the gets, all the maps, and all the puts. The reason I isolate these things into these sub-jobs is that it means I can run part of the process without running the whole. So if I get as far as putting and that fails and I realise I've got my mappings wrong, I just have to rerun the map layer and not the get layer. I've got a kind of staged set of data that is isolated. It also means I can more accurately monitor, test, and audit what the process is doing at each stage. So I'm going to jump out for a moment and show you this in Talend. Okay, so here we have my get job. As you can see, I have a Salesforce component which is reading from my Salesforce org and putting the data into a staging database table called source account. I have a map job which pulls it out of the staging table and moves it through a map into a target table. Talend's quite nice. It has these quite nice visual mappings components which allow you to see how your fields are being transformed. This is pretty straightforward, this one. So I've got my target table being loaded there. I've got a put job here which takes the target table, does another step of transformation. So these transformations here will be things like adding foreign keys that have been loaded into Salesforce already, parent IDs, hierarchies, that sort of stuff. And then out the end of that, we're capturing the successes and the failures into some audit tables. Then I have my orchestration job and my rollback or delete job. So I have a couple of orgs here. This is my old org. It's got loads of data in it of dubious quality. And this is my target org, which has a few records. It's just a trailhead org at the moment. And what I'm going to do is pull the data from my source org into my target. So let's run through each step one at a time. I'll go to my get job, and I'm going to run this. What I quite like about Talend is that it shows you the progress. It shows you how many records have moved through each path on the canvas, which gives you a bit of visual feedback on how well it's going, because you can see if there's a roadblock in one particular part of the flow, especially if they're more complicated. This is pretty simple. 422 rows into my staging table. Excellent. Now I'm going to map those. Click run. Let's see all of those map really quickly, and that's the benefit of using this is a local MySQL database that I'm staging on. It's a lot quicker than going off to a cloud system. Okay, so now I'm going to run the put, and this is going to pull all the data from the source and put it into the target. This is using the Salesforce bulk API. You can use the batch API. You certainly will need to for some entities which don't behave nicely over the bulk API. And you can see all 422 have come across into my success table. And let's go and check what we've now got in our target system. Okay. Oh, there we are. Brilliant. Playful shark. There we go. That's better. All accounts. And there we go. Lots and lots and lots of accounts of dubious quality migrated into my target Salesforce environment. The other thing to show you here is the MySQL tables. So I've got some tables here which show me for all of the runs I've done, what's been successful, what's failed. I've got some logs of the process. This is quite useful for showing what's gone wrong or what's moved through. You can then prove to your client that yes, we loaded 1,000 records here, and that was what was in your source system. You can also then use these metering logs to check the performance of your process and predict how quickly your migration is going to run in production. So let's jump back to the presentation now. Okay, so we had a look at the processes for get, map, put, delete, and run. And I showed you a bit about the staging database. So having spoken about that, I have a few kind of rules of thumb for that. I usually, if I'm using SQL Server, I'll separate out schemas for the logging of the data of the process versus the actual migration activity, and use some simple 3-letter prefixes for each table. So I have a table for the source data, a table for the target transformed data, a table that records what I actually loaded, which is the out tables. That would be where I'm recording the specific foreign keys that I've added. And then reference tables. So for example, user data, if you want to transform the ownership or maintain ownership from the source to the target, you'll need to pull a reference table of the target users and do some mappings to make sure your ownership's updated correctly. Final part in methods is testing. You want to make sure that the process does what it's supposed to do. For this, I recommend you are really upfront with your client and work out what's important to them. So define some key performance indicators and then design those into the process from the very beginning. So if they're a financial company and they're interested in money, their KPIs might be a certain number of dollars per account or grouped by certain things. That allows you to then build in some reports over the target system to verify that you've not those KPIs match within a certain tolerance. And then you need to repeat those tests every time you do an execution. If you use talent, like I've done, you'll get the ability to put data into a log schema, and then you can audit the process as well to see how it improves from one run to another. So how do we prove then that the migration was a success? You want to be doing testing as often and as quickly and as early as possible. So you'll do some unit tests on individual pieces of the migration, and that's where having it broken down into get, map, put, run and delete really helps, because you can test those parts in isolation. Then you want to tie them all together into an end-to-end test. Make sure for that environment you start with a clean slate so that you don't get any pollution of the data, and start timing your executions. Run a UAT test, which is a full run of the migration process with, if possible, data that is the production data or is at least as close as you can possibly get it. Involve the data owner and the data SME in testing that it looks right in the target system, and try and freeze your development at that point so that you're not trying to hit a moving target. Then finally, do some dry runs. Last time I did this, I did about 4 dry runs or so, and it really worked very well, because then when we did the final run through, it was a large migration of millions of records. We were able to finish about 10, 12 hours early, which was very good for the client. They were able to do a lot more testing on the data and the system that we were migrating to, and they were very happy with that. So definitely run 3 or 4 dry run migrations with everyone lined up who's working on the migration, and do it as if it were the production one. So that allows you to test your timings, make sure it's going to fit into your window, and give you a lot more confidence that you're going to be successful. So this is the summary for methods. Separate out your discovery from the actual delivery, re-estimate, agree some validation methods and KPIs with the customer early, and then be clear about who takes the risk for the migration in the contract. Right, technology. So for this, you want to be understanding the source and target systems. So you may assume it's Salesforce, but it might not be. What licenses have you got? What does the schema look like? How much data storage you've got? What file storage? And record all that in your design documents. You also want to consider whether you're going to turn on or leave off the triggers and automation in the target system, and likewise the validation rules. The reason you might want to do that is that your migration will be very slow if you've got significant triggers or workflow rules in the target system, because they will fire for every record that's loaded. If you decide to turn them off, you then have to make a call as to whether you need to implement the same features that are in those triggers in your migration process, which might make that more complex and increase the risk. So it's a trade-off, and one you'll need to work out during testing. So, tools. What can you use to do a data migration? You could use Excel. You can use some Excel plugins. You could use the Salesforce import wizard just to pull in accounts. That's quite simple. The Salesforce data loader will be fine for up to about 5 million records or so, I've done a recent project where I've hooked into the Salesforce data loader command line using Ant to kind of automate it and make it a little bit more robust than just running manual Salesforce data loader GUI processes. If you really want to scale up and make things repeatable and more manageable, I would recommend the Talent Data Integrator. There's a free version of this which you can use on a standalone machine, which works quite well. If you want to go really heavy duty, or you have a migration that's going to run many times, you could try MuleSoft as well. That can be used for it. Pentaho, SQL Server and integration services also, you can buy components that plug into Salesforce. And MySQL, great for using as a staging database. One of the things you also want to be careful of is the platform limits. So caveat here is these might now be out of date, so check before you execute. Things that are going to catch you out are around content. There's a maximum size each contact file can be, so you probably have to load those one at a time rather than bulking them up. You'll also find that you can't publish more than 200,000 in a 24-hour period, so even if you can push them into the system quickly enough, you won't be able to publish them, so bear that in mind. And then, so to finish off on technology, you need to find all your source systems, select tools that you know how to use, and check those governor limits. Okay, people. Who are we going to use or need with our data migration process? We need a data owner who is going to be the owner of a system. Could be the same as the system owner, but they really own the data that's going to be in the system. If you can't find or they can't nominate a data owner, you should push back on migrating the data. Because if you don't migrate the data, you will find out who the data owner is when they start complaining about where their data is. A bit late at that point, but best to point that out at the beginning. They will identify a data SME, and they will accept the output of the data migration process, including signing off UAT and the dry run testing. The data SME is the person who knows where all the skeletons are hidden. They know the ins and outs of all the data that's in their source system, they know how it's used, and they will be the ones who will be able to answer your questions about how to transform the data for the target system. Next up is your dev team. You're going to need to fill these 5 roles. A project manager to liaise with the client, report on progress, track milestones. A data migration architect to specify the design for the system and lead the developers. The developers to do the grunt work of actually building the processes in whatever tools you've chosen. It's also helpful to have a DBA if you're using a staging database to ensure that you've got indexes in the right place, that it's performing well and you've got no bottlenecks in your process. And then you want a really good tester, someone with a great eye for detail, who's going to be able to find those things that are a little bit awry in your process and help you fix them. So with all that, you've got those 3 categories of people. You then need to think about the skills that they need to have. So the data owner probably only needs a high-level understanding of ETL processes, but should really understand the consequences of some of those, so that when you tell them that they can't load a certain object, it doesn't have any unique keys, then they don't look at you blankly. The data SME is going to need a little bit more detailed knowledge of those concepts. Because you're going to be talking to them a lot more often about those things. Your dev team, they should really be quite expert at ETL or data manipulation. You want to make sure you pick a technology that matches their skill set as well. So if you're loading into Salesforce, you want people who are familiar with loading into Salesforce in order to identify those gotchas that they might otherwise fall over. So then, to summarise on people, you want clear ownership of the data and access to the SMEs. If you're waiting 5 hours or whatever to get in front of the SME or get answers, it's going to really slow you down. You need to get that information quickly. And then select a team that has experience with the tools you're going to use. Don't try and use a new tool set with a team, it will double or triple the amount of time it will take you because you'll be constantly learning. Okay, so to summarise then, data migrations are difficult, but we can make them less painful by remembering the 4 primary features of a successful data migration, which are data, methods, technology, and people. Okay, well, that's my presentation for today. I'm happy to answer some questions online after this, or now if we have a bit of time. Thank you very much. Yes, can we have a microphone, please? Yes.
From a data migration point of view, how do you keep that communication channel open so that you don't continue building against the targets?
So the way I do that is by having that data migration design document, or that Excel spreadsheet or something, in a shared location, Google Sheets or somewhere like that, and then version controlling it so you can see what you're building against, but keeping it live so that people get the latest information. Also building out little bits at a time, so the simple bits of account, run that through, check that works, and then add in additional fields, find the more complex stuff. But yeah, having a shared repository for what the truth is critical. Using Git or whatever to version things, it's a bit difficult with spreadsheets, but certainly, definitely, sharing that definition of what the mapping is and then iterating quickly.
I've got a second question as well, which is about decision making. So what data gets migrated, what the transformation was, quite often there's a lot of business decisions that need to be made as well.
Yes.
In the people section here, what role would it take and how to make it clear to the technical people what they need to do?
I think that would be the data SME because they understand what needs to be done, but the data owner would then have to ratify the decisions around those transformations. They may well have to take that information to a control board or something to get it signed off so that the rest of the business understands the consequences of what's being decided.
Right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. One question from my side would be, how could you actually cleanse the data or duplicate the data as part of the map process?
I recommend you don't, firstly, because it'll be difficult to track whether you've lost any records through errors. But if you do want to do the cleansing, I would recommend you do it either before or after the main ETL. And you can use Talend or the tools I've shown to do that. So you can pull the data into a staging table, define what your user key is for a unique record, identify the winners, and then update all the foreign keys for the losers so that they point back for all the child objects. It's a bit tricky, but you can do it. The team app in Talend is a great component for that. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.